So one thing that we need to keep in mind, and we always need to keep in mind, is that we really have this positive goal. We want to see ourselves positively. And what's really interesting is that in recent years, research has found that this is a fundamental need. We need to have a stable, positive sense of self. And it knowing that in and of itself, I think answers a lot of questions that we might have about not only consumers but people in general, right? So it's like dating, right? So if you've ever been on the quote unquote market dating and you meet people who objectively aren't in the best shape, right? So, they don't have a job, they can't pay any of their bills, and it's not COVID related. It's just that, they aren't really that ambitious. They got very little going on. And you're thinking, why does this person think that, they should be on the dating market, and that they're a winner, and that people will automatically want them, and part of it is that we have a positive sense of self, and that's driven by the fact that we have this fundamental need to maintain a positive sense of self. The question becomes, how do we explain this? How do we go about, you or I go about maintaining a positive sense of self when we have so many negative things going on in our lives? And the fact of the matter is, a lot of us have things that detract us from other people, right? Or other people or society or whatever would say are objectively not great things to have. But we have this high, sense of self, this positive self concept. How do we maintain that? Um, One of the things that we could argue that we do is that we have this positive self-talk, and we're kind of encouraged to have positive self-talk, right? Oh, I'm loved. Oh, I'm smart. Oh, I'm honest. Oh, I'm a winner. All of these things, and a lot of times it's because we've hyped ourselves up, and people around us have hyped us up. Most of us are around people who view us positively, and that helps to maintain this sense of self. There are some other theories, though, that are interesting when we think about our positive self concept. The first is self discrepancy theory, right? So it's this theory that we become distressed when our sense of who we are is discrepant, it differs, right, from our personal standards or our desired self concepts, our ideal self, or our ought self, right? So we could call it our ideal self, or we could call it our ought self, who we ought to be. Um, and so when there's this discrepancy between our actual self and our ideal self or ought self, um, how do we deal with that? How do we deal with the fact that we have failed to live up to standards? Well, if they're our own standards, right, and if they're our own sense of discrepancy between our actual and our ideal self, then we have this emotional discomfort, right? We have these feelings of dejection, we're sad, we're depressed, we have dissatisfaction, right? So yeah, you believe that you should, by the age of 25, be the next Mark Zuckerberg, and it turns out that you end up getting a job at Walmart and you're slaving away coding all day. So you didn't really make your standard for yourself. You believe that you should be the next Lewis Hamilton, a famous race car, F1 racing driver, who just won his seventh championship, and who unfortunately right now has COVID-19. Anyway, you believe that you're a great kart racer and that you're going to grow up to be the next Lewis Hamilton, and by the time you're 19, you're nowhere near the F1 circuit. You're not even in F2 or any of those races, and so you might feel this way. On the other hand, there are sometimes when we see this discrepancy of our actual self versus our ideal self that others have prescribed for us, right? So let's say you reach the age of 22 and you're taking you've done all your prereqs or whatever to get into med school, and you take the MCAT, which is the test that you are supposed to take to get into to med school and you get a really low score, and so you don't get admitted to med school. And what's important to you is that your parents wanted you to become a doctor, right? And so your actual self, you're not a doctor, you're not getting into med school, versus the ideal self that your parents see, you know, is problematic. What happens in those instances? Well, in those instances, we feel more anxiety related emotions. One of the things you'll notice right now about self discrepancy theory is that it helps us understand reasons that we might feel bad, reasons we might be depressed, reasons we might feel anxious, right? Maybe your mom expected you to be the next beauty pageant winner, and you were going to be the next Miss America, but instead it turns out, you never made it past the second circuit, which is sixth graders or something like this. I don't know. Yeah, you might feel some kind of way. You might be anxious or worried about that. So, self completion theory says that when we experience some threat to a value aspect of ourself, right, our identity, um, then we are highly motivated to seek social recognition of that identity. So, let's say you enter, they like to use cooking a lot in these examples, but say you enter a cooking contest because you know that you're an amazing cook, right? So you enter a contest to bake, apple pies because you know you're an amazing baker. And you go to the contest and you spend all day and your family comes down to hear the results, and they announce a winner and you don't even qualify in the top three. You are crushed, right? You know that you're an amazing baker, you've been baking your whole life, yada yada yada. What do you do? Well, what research tells us and what self completion theory tells us is that we would do everything in our power to be praised as a cook, and get some kind of social recognition. So we lost the contest, so we immediately go home and we make this magnificent feast for our family so that our family can say, "Oh, Cassandra, you're the best cook I've ever met. You're amazing. This creme brulee, I've never had anything better in my life," yada yada yada, right? And part of the reason is going back to this idea of a positive self concept, right? We want to maintain a positive self concept. So our self concept was a bit nipped when we didn't win in the cooking contest or the baking contest. So we immediately sought some way to be recognized as someone who is good in that chosen activity, in that identity based or linked. I think linked is a better word here. Um, Contest, or I'm sorry, identity linked domain, I should say, or area, right? So in the case of the example that I used, the domain or the area is cooking, right, or baking. So we would make an attempt and be highly motivated to get some kind of recognition that we actually are good bakers, even though we lost the contest. Okay, so keeping on with our theories, our next theory is called self-evaluation maintenance theory. And so this theory says that our self-concept can be threatened by another's behavior. So far we've been really, with these theories, talking about how our own behavior can affect our self-concept. Self-evaluation maintenance theory says other people's behavior can threaten our self-concept. And the level of threat that we feel is usually determined by the closeness of the other person, right? Is it a close friend? Is it a lover? Is it a parent? Is it a sibling? So on and so forth. And the relevance of the behavior. So we talked about cooking in the last example. If cooking is important to you, this would increase the level of threat that you feel by the other individual's behavior. So according to self-evaluation maintenance theory, we feel bad when a close friend, or a close other, outperforms us on a task that is relevant to our self definition, to our identity, right? So if we consider ourselves a good cook and our close friend outperforms us in a cooking related area, we're going to feel bad. So go back to that cooking, the baking contest. You didn't win at all, but your best friend won. And you're like, holy, there's a word that ends with that phrase, but I'm not going to say it. You feel really bad, right? On the other hand, there is absolutely no problem if a close friend outperforms you on a task that's not relevant to your self definition. So, if you're a great baker and your friend is an amazing mathematician and they win some kind of math award, and you're like, yes, because you don't care, you don't do anything math related. So you're not thinking to yourself, man, I suck. You're like, man, that's amazing. That's my friend, right? And in fact, what happens is, and you can imagine, that you feel great about yourself. When our friend does something good, I mean, you've experienced this when you're like, "That's my girl, that's my boy, yeah, yeah," because it allows us to bask in reflected glory, right? We get to do that. We get to barg, right? We talked about this in another lecture. But when a close friend does really well in something that has nothing to do with our own personal identity, we feel amazing and we feel amazingly happy for them. But we don't feel that way if it's something that's connected to our sense of self, which makes sense, right? And that's why it can be hard to be really good friends with your colleagues or your peers, because eventually, if you all are aiming for the same thing, if they outperform you, you might feel bad about yourself. So what do we do? So if a friend outperforms us in a domain or an area that we consider to be important to our sense of identity, our sense of self, what do we do? Well, there are three things, we usually do. Usually we do one of these things, but I guess you could do more than one. One thing that we do is we distance ourselves from the person, right? So your friend won that baking contest, and you're like, let me just not answer these calls for a minute. Let's not hang out, right? You guys have a chess tournament, go into a chess tournament or a poker tournament, and they outperform you, and you're feeling bad. You're like, let me just take a little break from them. The second, you could do everything you can to improve your performance, right? So if it's a math competition or a poker tournament or a baking contest and you don't win and your friend does, you go home and you practice, 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 right? You burn the midnight oil trying to become the best mathematician or poker player or pie baker or whatever it is that you can be, so that next time you're the person who's on the stage, and not sitting in the crowd. Or the last thing you should do, of course, is reduce the relevance of that task, right? So you didn't win and your friend did, and you feel bad about yourself. You can just say, you know what, maybe I'm not the best baker. And in fact, baking isn't even important. This is kind of stupid. I need to get a new hobby, right? Something like that. So, another threat to our self concept or a threat to our self esteem happens when we behave in ways that are contrary to our attitudes, right? So, we have this cognitive dissonance because we behave in ways that are contrary to our existing attitudes. So, if that happens, how do we restore our self-esteem? So let's say we smoke, even though we know that smoking is a health hazard. Not only is it some level of cognitive dissonance, it impacts our self-esteem. We don't feel good about ourselves when we do that. If you think drugs are bad and you spent this weekend, because we're in Michigan, going to the weed shop and smoking an ounce or vaping or whatever it is, you choose to do. You ate some lovely muffins, however you get down. I don't know. I don't want to judge. I'm a judgment-free kind of woman. No one believes that but me, but I do believe that about myself. So however you get down, if you believe that drugs are bad, but you spent this time in Michigan getting high because you are in Michigan, and in Michigan it's legal, how do you feel? How do you restore your self-esteem after you've done something that you think is, contrary to your attitudes? Well, self affirmation theory suggests that we reduce the impact of the threat, the threat of feeling bad about ourselves, by affirming our competence in an unrelated area, right? So, oh, I feel so bad. I went and smoked an ounce of weed this weekend, and I think drugs are bad, but I did it with my friends because that's what they were doing, and it's legal here, but I still think it's bad. What should I do? What should I do? What should I do? Well, you might do something like, yes, I smoked this ounce, but at the same time, you know what? I happened on Sunday to spend all day cleaning up my house, right? You could say, you know what? I'm an amazing cleaner, right? So that's your competence in an unrelated area. You were thinking about cleaning, your discrepancy was related to drugs. Or you could say something like, I am going to jog every day this week for my health, right? You affirm that you're competent when it comes to maintaining your health, because you feel bad about the discrepancy between, your view on drugs and doing drugs. So, what's really interesting is that when it comes to self affirmation theory, the people who tend to do it most are the people who already had high self esteem to begin with. So, what you would think intuitively, I think most of us would think, is that people with low self esteem actually engage with self affirmation. They do something wrong, their sense of self is really hurt, and so they go ahead and self affirm. Well, it turns out what really happens is that people who already have high self esteem go ahead and self affirm. And if you think about it, this makes sense. What they say in terms of the literature is that if you want to have high self esteem, or if you want to think about what marks or kind of stands out about people with high self esteem, one of the things is that they tend to um, accept themselves, right? So they engage in self acceptance quite a bit. So for people with high self esteem, they would look at this failing, oh, I don't believe in drugs, but I smoke drugs. They would say something like, it's okay, right? Like people do things sometimes that they don't agree with, it's fine, and then affirm themselves in something different to maintain that high self esteem, right? Whereas, from my point of view, sometimes people with lower self esteem don't engage in activities that would strengthen their self esteem. I'm not saying it's true for all people, nor am I saying it's true for all activities or tasks that we're thinking about, but sometimes that is the case. And then the last theory that I'm going to talk about is self-enhancement theory. Well, that I'm going to talk about in this kind of section of the lecture is self-enhancement theory. So, according to self-enhancement theory, one way that we feel good about ourselves is to distort or exaggerate our positive qualities. And we do that uh, through a self-enhancement process. And the self enhancement process can be different for pretty much all of us or any of us. But at the end of the day, self enhancement theory says that we tend to hold these unrealistically positive views about ourselves, right? If you ask people how intelligent they are, most people would say that they're above average. But the fact of the matter is that there is an average. And because there is an average, 50% of us have to be below that average. But we don't think of things like that. And you can see this guy right now in the picture or in the slide. He's kind of flexing his muscles. And in his view, he looks like his shadow. But the reality is he, looks like himself. And we all do this. We kind of distort our positive qualities to enhance ourselves. And research shows that it makes us feel better, right? We distort reality to paint this flattering picture of ourselves, and when you do that, you tend to have this higher self-esteem. So one thing that stands out to me personally, thinking about something like this is this the reason that we Photoshop ourselves? Is this the reason that we have these kind of I don't really do this, I'm not on social media, but that people and kind of celebrities who are also people, um, uh, post these pictures of themselves where they, subtract the negatives, enhance the positives, recreate themselves, and all these other things. And, I always wonder, when I see pictures that are obviously photoshopped, if people doing this feel good about the fact that they're showing a photoshopped image. And according to self enhancement theory, they do. What I find interesting, though, or what I think would actually be interesting to me, because I shouldn't say what I find interesting. I should say I find this interesting because to me, doing this, photoshopping yourselves, and going and even making the attempt to Photoshop yourself, to me sounds like it's an admission that you don't like the way you look, or an admission that you consider yourself um, not that great, and so you feel the need to Photoshop yourself. And self enhancement theory actually says the opposite, right? Self enhancement theory actually says we feel so good about ourselves that we feel good sending out a picture of our best self, right? And maybe it's because when we think about ourselves, we really don't think about these details that would take away from how great we think we are, right? So maybe when the girl on the bottom here thinks about herself, she pictures herself as this beautiful woman who actually doesn't have acne, even though she's the same beautiful woman with acne. Let me be clear about that part. But she might think that, posting herself without acne is the right thing to do because that's not really how she views herself, because society doesn't view acne to be that great. So I always think of, and this is no shade toward her, so I don't want anybody sending me emails about this, but I always think of someone like uh, one of the who's the one, Khloe Kardashian. I always think of someone like Khloe Kardashian, right? So we all know that Khloe Kardashian posts these images of herself on social media that look literally not like her, not even a little bit. Like they are so far. Like this lady slims down her face. She just does some stuff, right? And so I always think, wow, I mean, every time I do that, I would feel really bad about myself. But maybe that's just not the case. But I also think that I would feel bad about myself because I have a kid, and I would be showing my kid that, like, who you actually are isn't good enough. But again, self enhancement theory says I'm thinking about this completely wrong, right? So, from a literature standpoint, self enhancement theory would say that how I view selfies and how I view photoshopping selfies is actually incorrect, right? So, the way that I'm thinking about selfies is just not quite right. Self enhancement theory would say that people who are photoshopping themselves uh, are feeling better about themselves, right? And it helps our self esteem. So there you go. Last thing, and then I'll move on to a different topic. Self enhancement, right? This desire to think of ourselves as better who we are, yada yada, is a Western phenomena, right? It normally happens in Western cultures. Please remember that. In Asian cultures, what we find is something different. In Asian cultures, rather than self enhancement, they tend to have self effacement, meaning they view themselves more negatively. Hine and Renshaw in 2002, I want to say 22, but I struggle real hard with that. 22. No, 2002 found American students perceive themselves more positively than their friends perceive them, right? We self enhance. On the other hand, Japanese students perceive themselves more negatively than their friends perceive them. So remember again, self enhancement is a Western phenomena. In Asian cultures, typically what you'll get is self-effacement, which is, humility and modesty and meekness. Um, Not to be religious, but the Bible says, "Blessed are the meek," right? The Beatitudes. For those of you who are uh, familiar with the Bible. Anyway, so something to consider and something to think about.